Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests and viewers joining us online, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to the TRT World Forum 2020. Now, this session is entitled America versus China, Trade Wars, COVID-19 and Future Economic Relations. I'm Maria Ramos. I'm a news anchor at TRT World here in Istanbul, and it's great to have you with us wherever you're joining us from. Now, we have a fantastic lineup of leading experts to discuss the friction that has dominated the world's two biggest economies, the US and China. Friction accelerated, exacerbated even by COVID-19, but friction that could possibly, from January the 20th, begin to fade. Now, back in July this year, the New York Times described how the Cold War between China and the US is intensifying. Now, it listed the tensions, and here are some examples. America orders China's Houston consulate be shut. Trump blames China for spreading COVID-19, calling it the China virus, the Wuhan virus. A trade war that's lasted more than 2 years. A battle over technology, particularly Huawei. Even Chinese students getting their visas cancelled. Now, the list goes on. It really is very long indeed, but we have a debate, and let's see which items from this list could possibly be crossed off. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce my distinguished guests. And joining us is, first of all, Stephen M. Ward, Professor of International Affairs at Harvard Kennedy School. Next, we have Charles Kupchan, Professor of International Affairs at Georgetown University and a former advisor in both the Clinton and Obama administrations, and now to Team Biden. Next, we have Peter Berkowitz, Director of Policy Planning Staff at the US Department of State, providing advice to the US Secretary of State. Next, Cheng Li, Director at John L. Thornton China Center at the Brookings Institution. Richard Fontaine, CEO of the Center for a New American Security and a former advisor to the late Senator John McCain. Then we have Stephen A. Orleans, President of the National Committee on US-China Relations since 2005, and Shi Yinghong, Professor of International Relations at Renmin University of China in Beijing. Gentlemen, welcome to you all. Now, my first question goes to Stephen M. Ward because he's lined up first. Now, I just want to get a sense of where we are right now, because it really has been an incredible year. We're ending the Trump presidency. We're about to begin the Biden presidency. And I just want to see, is the worst between the US and China over right now? And will the Biden administration bring the diplomatic skills to really stop this downward spiral?
The low point, if you want to call it that, between U.S. and Chinese relations. And I think what you have to recognize is the current level of animosity or competitiveness didn't begin with President Trump. The relationship has been becoming more contentious, more of a rivalry for quite some time. This really, I think, began in the Bush administration. Then, remember, it was the Obama administration that began the so-called pivot to Asia or rebalancing to Asia. The Trump administration took that a step further, and I believe the Biden administration will continue to compete with China in a whole variety of ways, just as China will be competing with the United States, while trying to wall off the few areas where the two countries should continue to cooperate, most notably trying to manage their economic relationship, deal with future pandemics, and address climate change. But the point is that this is not a recent development, and the two states, as the two most powerful countries in the world, are going to remain rivals for many years to come.
Interesting that you say they haven't reached their lowest point. I want to go next to Charles Kupchan, who is next to you. Where do you think China-US relations go now?
I would agree with Steve that we haven't hit rock bottom. And for a couple of different reasons, I can imagine the US-China dialogue getting worse after Biden takes office. One is Biden will speak up more often about human rights, Hong Kong, the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, other issues. Beijing will not like that. And secondly, I expect the trade confrontation to actually escalate. My guess is that Biden will probably pull back on tariffs with allies, but try to front to press China on the big trade agenda, in part because Biden's top priority for at least the first year in office is going to be reaching out to the American middle class, getting the economy going again, creating jobs. And part of that means having a more level playing field with China when it comes to trade. I do think you're likely to see a couple of important changes on China policy. One is that there'll be a policy. The Trump foreign policy has really come in fits and starts. It's been policy by tweet. I think there'll be a real policy process in Washington to try to create a sustained approach to China. And the second change I expect to see is dialogue. The strategic dialogue that began during the Obama years has pretty much collapsed under Trump. There really isn't a sustained conversation. I think that's a problem. And Biden is a diplomat. Biden believes in personal relationships. Biden will want to try to have a conversation with the Chinese about everything: security, trade, human rights. Will that improve the relationship? Very difficult to say, but I do think that there will be much more engagement diplomatically than there has been over the last couple of years, and probably more cooperation on the pandemic, since that is issue number one for Biden, getting the pandemic under control.
Absolutely, and I really want to get to that very soon. I just want to jump next to Peter Berkowitz. What is the mood like right now in the State Department?
We are all concentrating on the tasks at hand. We are working forward. The world continues to present big challenges, not least the China challenge. And if I may, responding a bit to what's already been said, the policy planning staff has just brought out a long paper called "The Elements of the China Challenge." In it, we take on the conventional wisdom about China. And I'd like to offer just a few comments in response to what's been said. First, I agree with Professor Walt that the China challenge didn't begin yesterday. It didn't begin with a global pandemic. We think it's a mistake in the policy planning staff to see the pandemic as some kind of inflection point, changes world politics. What we see is the global pandemic, which did indeed arise in China and became a global pandemic because of a concerted disinformation campaign conducted by the Chinese Communist Party. We see that as clarifying for the nations of the world conduct on the international scene that has been typical of China. As for under the CCP, as for the question of human rights and dialogue, I think we really have to emphasize what has been going on for the last 4 years. The fact is, no Secretary of State before Mike Pompeo made the question of human rights in China, China's gross abuses in Xinjiang, more than 1 million Uyghurs in concentration camps, the repression of Tibetans, the repression of ethnic Mongolians, the repression of 70 million Christians in China. No Secretary of State has done more to bring into focus those abuses. And a final point right now where we are on dialogue, relations with India, bilateral relations with India, Japan, Australia have never been better. And the revitalization of the Quad, including the United States, has been driven by an acute appreciation of the challenge that China represents to the entire Indo-Pacific region. My final point for now is that, and we bring this out in our paper, The Elements of the China Challenge, the United States continues to seek cooperation with China, but the kind of cooperation that we want is cooperation that's based on well-recognized international norms, especially in commerce. We want commerce based on fairness and reciprocity.
Thank you so much for that perspective from the US State Department. And Cheng Li, what do you think? Just to continue with this subject, what do you think the Biden administration will bring? Will it bring some sort of change to the acrimony that we have seen over the past year, particularly between the US and China?
Well, first of all, Biden administration, including President-elect himself and his major advisors, said repeatedly that Trump administration China policy is a failure, which means that it will pursue something differently. And yes, I agree with Professor Kupchan that will be emphasized on human rights. We talk about the international coalition building and etc. But he sees China more as a competitor rather than the enemy. And so he will emphasize competition rather than confrontation. Also, he sees China and Russia differently. During the campaign, he and his team said it was Russia to interfere, American election, not China. Now, he also has kind of strong ties with Chinese leadership. He visits China 4 times and met with Xi Jinping 11 times. And of course, he has been critical about some of our policies, but at least that he will not do the things that as the Chinese pursue that really want to contain China. Because from Chinese perspective, what happened in the past 6 months or a year, it's really wanted to completely contain China. On the economic front, it's really a complete systematic decoupling with China in virtually every areas on the economic front. U.S. government, the Trump administration, even think about the use FARA, the U.S. law, to ban American companies doing lobby for good relationship with China. They will consider them as the Chinese Communist Party's agent. This is really far away from the legitimate lobby. On the political front, the Trump administration wanted to have a regime change, calling for overthrow the Chinese Communist Party. Now, I'm not a fan of the China's party state, but let's just think about the Chinese government will allow that to happen. And also Chinese people with this kind of pressure, they may not necessarily inspired by US, rather instead they were surrounded with the Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership. On the military and security front, Chinese perceive that the current administration pushed too much on Taiwan. They are leading towards acknowledge Taiwan's independence. Whether they have the legitimate concern or not is a different matter, but this is what they perceive. So Xi Jinping and the certain Chinese leadership want to prepare a war with China, in Xi Jinping's words, to prepare a war, to prevent a war. And so that's a very, very dangerous situation. So I think that in a way, that the arrival of the Biden administration at least will halt or slow down this kind of speedy confrontation. So that's very, very important.
So slow down that confrontation. Thank you so much, Cheng Li. I want to jump back to Stephen Orlins, your view of where we are now and what happens next come January the 20th.
Great panel, great comments. First, I think it's correct to say these problems preceded the arrival of President Trump and will exist after President Trump has left office. There is no question that changes that occurred in China, combined with changes that occurred in the United States, have led to where we are today. Having said that, I believe that we will likely have hit rock bottom 49 days from today. I don't know what Mr. Berkowitz and his colleagues at the State Department or in the White House are planning, but we've seen actions which are designed to punish the Chinese further for alleged sins or actual sins. When President-elect Biden takes office, we're going to see certain actions. We know we're going to see certain actions which are going to provide a foundation for cooperation. We're going to see America rejoin the Paris Accords, which means that climate change is going to get on the agenda for U.S.-China discussions. We're going to see the United States rejoin the WHO, which means that pandemic prevention is going to be on the American agenda. President Biden recognizes that the restrictions on people-to-people contact, on Chinese students in the United States, on people who wish to remain in the United States to work, injure America. I think we're going to see changes in those policies which allow for better U.S.-China relations. We've heard tariffs. President-elect Biden believes that the tariffs imposed on China have cost Americans jobs. We know, despite what the President of the United States says, which is China pays these tariffs, that the American people pay these tariffs. And it hurts the American people, especially those kind of working families. People who are not high income in the United States are paying these tariffs. So I expect early in the Biden administration, we'll have a discussion about how the Chinese can end a lot of their tariff and non-tariff barriers, and how the United States will end its and help the American people and the American consumer. So there are a lot of issues which will set a positive tone. They won't resolve the fundamental issues. They won't resolve, we've heard reference to the human rights issues. They won't resolve the South China Sea issues. They won't resolve the national security law passage for Hong Kong. They won't resolve things which are really tough, but they will make progress, and we will see a professionalization of the interaction. We won't see foreign policy by tweet anymore.
Foreign policy by tweet, policy by tweet. It has been an incredible presidency, and even for us as journalists to see those tweets and cover so much through Twitter. Richard Fontaine, your view, where we are right now and what will happen come January the 20th?
You're certainly going to see some differences in style from a new administration, in tone, in the way messages are delivered, in the way dialogue is conducted. But I think you're likely to see very little change in the underlying conditions that give rise to the U.S.-China competition in the first place. So, for example, look at what divides the United States and China today. The United States is worried about China playing a more dominant role in Asia. China wants to play a more dominant role in Asia. China wants to develop military capabilities that would push the United States military away from the Asian mainland. The United States doesn't want to see that. China would like to control the South China Sea. The United States would like to see China not control the South China Sea. China would like to dominate the politics of Hong Kong in violation of its internationally agreed agreements. The United States doesn't want to see that. China wants to keep Uyghurs in camps in Xinjiang. The United States doesn't want Uyghurs in camps in Xinjiang. You can kind of go through the list here. On Australia, the Chinese want to penalize Australia for calling for an independent inquiry into coronavirus and put sanctions on the export of their goods. The United States wants to see the opposite. So those things are not going to go away. They're not peculiar to the Trump administration or the Biden administration. Those are differences in interests and outlook between the two governments. And that means that the United States and China are going to be in a position of long-term competition. The priorities will change a little bit under the Biden administration. I think less emphasis on the trade deficit and getting the Chinese to buy goods that are made and grown in swing states in the United States or by part of the Trump political base, more emphasis on human rights. The big question is on this cooperation notion where, you know, the Trump administration didn't really seek Chinese cooperation on climate change or on COVID. It did on North Korea, but you didn't have a really big set of cooperative areas that could be infected by the competitive spirit. And the Biden administration will come in saying, we want to cooperate with China on COVID. We want to cooperate with China on climate change. We might want to cooperate with China on North Korea and non-proliferation, but we want to compete in all these other areas. And it's just not clear that those two things can be done simultaneously, where you can really cooperate in areas of common interest as if you're not competing fiercely in these other areas. I think they will try, but it's not clear to me they'll be successful.
That's a very interesting point you bring up there, whether you can cooperate and compete at the same time in different areas. Finally, on this point, Xi Jinping, what is the perspective from China on Team Biden?
Of course, the situation become complicated, and because if you look at, taking into account of a lot of numerous major negative elements from the profound domestic transformation of China and severely developed or deteriorated strategic military rivalry between two countries, or you come to and a great impact, negative impact of pandemic, and all of those things, you can see that Joe Biden will continue to compete with China and confrontation with China on a lot of major issue areas. And even, and if you look at the domestic situation in the highly divided United States, and I believe that the Biden administration have to appeasing and in a various way in some major issues, and both to and Democratic radicals and also to the grassroots and whites, that is Republican populists. And you can see human rights problem, religion situation in China and Hong Kong and Tibet and South China Sea, all are the big problems which could continue, or even in some issue area, to intensify further the rivalry and confrontation between Biden's American and China. But on the other hand, and if you take into full account of the extremely enormous and wilderness, vulgarity, and volatility of Trump administration, and if you look at especially the President Trump's personal political, temperament, you could see that Biden is much normal and statesman and even diplomats, and he will and bring some, at least, the credibility and therefore stability back to Sino-American relations. And also, and who I expected that the sooner or later, and maybe 2 years later or 1.5 years later, he will striving for and improve the trade situation between China and the United States to reduce and too great amount of the American export enforced upon China, to make it to compatible in some degree China's capability and China's real requirement. And also there is possibility that sooner or later he will have in some degree and high tariff imposed upon China export to the United States. And also he will bring about something just the normal diplomatic or even military communication and dialogue with China to reverse the already existing diplomatic decoupling, if we and think of the higher level of communication, which only in the past few months only happened between Yang Jiechi and Pompeo in Hawaii, with nothing and produced from their meetings and the conference. And also he will, and at least in principle or rhetorically, just like China, and to brought back the United States to commit to global governance and global multilateralism. So in principle, there's a possibility that there would be some, limited and the cooperation between two countries over, for example, over pandemic, battle against the pandemic, or over adjusting to climate change, or over anti-terrorism, or to make situation better in the civil and the cyberspace security. But at the same time, and these cooperation will be quite limited and will completed by competition between the countries for prestige, for what influence, and altogether, and the situation could become a little better, and in some issue area and major issue areas, and this is valued by most of Chinese scholars on international relations, because present situation and between the countries are much worse, and worse than in past few decades. If we continue to have another major round of so-called free falling and deterioration, and I think that the military conflict between the countries could be very clearly imagined. So situation could become somewhat better, but quite limited. But anyway, and we finally could have something just like normal American president to deal with. I think that this will bring some stability back to the bilateral relations.
Stability. Professor Xi, thank you very much for that. I want to speak now about COVID-19, something that has just defined absolutely every inch, every centimetre of our lives right now. It's a key issue for President-elect Biden, as Charles Kupchan mentioned, and you've all more or less talked about areas where we could see possible cooperation. Now, I want to ask this question, and I will go back to the beginning. My question will be to Stephen Walt. Did President Trump and President Xi miss an opportunity to cooperate on COVID-19? And could Joe Biden's presidency and Xi Jinping now find this as an area of cooperation?
I don't think there was a great missed opportunity here, in the sense that if the two states had gotten together, at the very beginning, or once it was clear we had a global pandemic, that they could have done something together about it to get vaccines more quickly or to deal with it. What needs to happen going forward would be better preparations for the next pandemic. And I would just remind everyone that COVID-19 is one of several pandemics, or close to pandemics, we've seen. We've had AIDS, we've had SARS, we've had Middle East respiratory syndrome, Ebola in Africa. There's every reason to expect that something like COVID-19 could happen again in the future, and therefore a task going forward is for the international community to be much better prepared the next time this goes on. I think what happened here really took sort of three different phases, or we've been through two phases and we're now heading into the third. In the first phase, China badly mishandled the outbreak, as was previously said, didn't report accurately, and it's one of the reasons we ended up with a global pandemic. So China's initial response was very bad and showed some of the real limitations of the Chinese system. Since then, of course, China's response to the problem at home has been quite effective, which is why they've been able to reopen their economy to a greater extent than the rest of us. In the second phase, of course, it's when the United States and some other countries badly mishandled the pandemic at home, and which is why we're dealing now with spiking infection levels and rising death tolls, and we aren't able to reopen our economy more effectively. So in the second phase, the United States and some of its allies performed badly, and that's, I think, damaged the American reputation, even our reputation for being basically competent. But I think we're now heading into the third phase, which is the vaccine phase, where the United States appears to have, if not the lead, at least at the very edge of vaccine development, and may in fact end up having the most effective vaccines to fix the situation here at home, but also to then be able to help other countries. So it's possible that in the third phase, the United States and perhaps some of its allies will look like they are the ones who've ultimately responded and helped give the world the answer. Now, it's worth noting that China has developed some vaccines of its own. They've been offering them to developing countries, but it remains to be seen how effective any of these treatments, ours, theirs, vaccines being developed in Russia, etc., are ultimately going to be. A year from now, the situation of sort of which country ultimately handled this better might change from what it looks right now. And I agree with Charlie Kupchan in saying that this has to be the top priority for the Biden administration. If within a few months they can get the United States essentially back to normal, get the economy recovering more rapidly as a result of that, they'll look very good. If they're unable to do that, that's going to be a political liability for them and also could undermine the American position more broadly in the world.
Thank you so much. I want to jump to Cheng Li and ask, is the criticism from the US and many other countries of China's handling of the coronavirus, especially at the beginning, is that criticism misplaced?
The criticism of the early weeks of the way Chinese government handle, especially local government, I think this is valid criticism. I think that especially the government of Wuhan and Hubei made grave mistakes, including their slow response, spread of misinformation, and mistreatment of Dr. Li Wenliang, the whistleblower, and political censorship, and also possible cover-up. These are all varied. Also, Chinese public themselves also criticize the government, the way they handle. But after first few weeks, certainly Chinese government tried to correct all these mistakes. They now treat Li Wenliang, at least in Syria, as a hero, and really prevented even stronger criticism of the Chinese government. But also the way they handle, especially the Xi Jinping government, put the people's health as the top priority rather than economic development. Very decisively locked down Wuhan. Of course, this is the way the Chinese is doing things. This is probably will not be duplicating anywhere in the world. So there's a mixed reaction in China, but the overall Chinese public support the government effort. Let's look at some numbers. Actually, Chinese constantly use this number to refer to China's success and the U.S. failure. I mean, China's total number of infection, according to WHO, is 94,000, about half the daily infection rate in the United States in the recent weeks. China's total number of deaths is 4,750. I mean, about the death toll over 2 to 3 days in the U.S. So the total number of deaths in New York City is over 24,000. The total deaths in Beijing is 9, and Shanghai is 7, Chongqing is 6, and Tianjin is 3. Now, people sometimes cynical about this number, but you cannot cover up the contagious disease. I mean, if you have the dozen people in Shanghai, people will announce that. Now, also that I think with another hand, I think Trump's astonishing shift from early on praising Chinese leaders to handle coronavirus in early February and also January, all of a sudden to bring everything to China. I think this is certainly quite dramatic. I do not think it resonated well. And also, I particularly astonished as a Chinese American when he's in the campaign, he's blamed American medical doctors or nurses, the medical workers, for making money out of COVID-19. I think this is not acceptable. So make you wonder whether his criticism, accusation has really the validity. And also that his use of the term Chinese virus or the Gong flu and etc. certainly caused more anti-Asian kind of hate crimes. Now, I want to share with you one important development. This is released in today's Wall Street Journal article. The new coronavirus infected people in the US in middle December 2019. So really a few weeks or a couple of months earlier than reported. And it was early before it was officially identified in China. So scientists at the US CDC, this US CDC, found that there's 106 out of 7,000 blood donation collected by American Red Cross from residents of 9 states. They found this over 100 cases of infected in middle December. So this is certainly make us to rethink, to revisit the origin of the coronavirus. Again, I'm not a scientist, but this is a report published by Wall Street Journal today, and also it's acknowledged by scientists of US CDC. So that's put the things into perspective. I think the most important things is not to point a finger at this moment, but rather, as Steve and Charlie said, we should really promote cooperation, whether it be prevention, treatment, particularly vaccine, and the international distribution. I think these two major powers, China and United States, should collaborate not only to prevent their own citizens, in terms of getting more coronavirus and also vaccine their own citizens, but also collaborate on the international scale, particularly for later developing countries.
Cheng Li, thank you very much indeed. You bring out many interesting points, and I want to get a reaction and opinion from Charles Kupchang, and especially with regards to what Cheng Li said. This is the Chinese way of doing things. Are there lessons that the US can learn, can draw from China's model?
I want to answer that question, Maria, by going back to the question you posed to Steve Walt, because I have a slightly different take on the issue of whether there was a missed opportunity. I think there was, and that early on in the pandemic, in January and February, we could have seen a different approach by China and the United States. There could have been an effort to share scientific information on the virus, to produce and distribute medical equipment, to begin cooperation on vaccine exploration. And neither country was willing to go down that road. Cheng Li just cataloged some of the mistakes that China made, but I think it's safe to say that the United States dropped the ball both at home and abroad. It wasn't until March that President Trump held a G7 call with allies to discuss the pandemic. So I do think that going our separate ways, not coming together to deal with the greatest global pandemic since 1918, that was a matter of choice. That did not need to happen. And that's why I think that it's important to keep in mind that it is not foreordained that we're going back to some sort of Cold War. And I would point out that on the pandemic, on climate change, perhaps on North Korea, there is an opportunity here for the US and China to find common ground. And one big difference that we need to keep in mind is that we're not in a fragmented economy like we were during the Cold War. I don't believe that decoupling is possible. I think there'll be a reallocation of supply lines, but the global economy is too interdependent to pull it apart and to go back to a world of two or more blocks. The final point I want to make here, because I think it's an important part of the conversation and it hasn't come in yet, is domestic politics and nationalism. You know, it's clear that President Trump kept talking about the Wuhan virus, the China flu, in part to play into nationalism and anti-Chinese sentiment, in part because there is a bipartisan consensus here in the United States to take a tough line on China. That is one of the few areas where Democrats and Republicans agree. And in China as well, Xi Jinping has created a presidency, a political brand that very much relies upon nationalism and standing up to the United States and pushing outward, Belt and Road. And so even though we have these areas of cooperation on the pandemic, on the economy, on climate change, I do think we have to keep an eye on the ability of Joe Biden and Xi Jinping to manage nationalism and to make sure that domestic political forces don't push them in the direction of increasing competition.
Thank you so much, Charles Kupchan. Peter Berkowitz, that same question. Did President Trump and Xi Jinping miss an opportunity to team up to fight COVID-19 this year, especially at the beginning? And what lessons can we learn from China? And is the US even willing to?
Yes, well, I think we have to think more carefully about what the obstacles to cooperation were. It's been an oddity of much of the conversation so far to argue that the principal sources of lack of cooperation come from the United States. But again, as policy planning staff argues in our long paper, the elements of the China challenge, one, this competition, as others have said, didn't begin yesterday. But when did it begin? It especially began decades ago with the Chinese Communist Party, which has understood the world as divided into two camps, with the oppressor camp being led by the United States, the leader of the free world. That's been a big problem. And over the decades, as the Chinese Communist Party has modernized and has grown the economy of China, the party has become even more assertive, insisting on a fundamental divide. As I said before, we regard the outbreak of the pandemic not as an inflection point, but as a clarifying moment which brought into focus not only for the United States, but many countries around the world, China's malign practices. What do I have in mind? Practices that interfere with cooperation, not only cracking down on freedom in Hong Kong, not only defying norms of international law in the South China Sea, but economic practices of co-optation and coercion in every region of the world. Charlie has mentioned Bridge and Road Initiative, which has created debt traps for many countries around the world. The Trump administration has rallied countries from many regions of the world, more than 50 countries now, to join the Clean Network. What is the Clean Network? Countries devoted to creating digital communications networks that do not rely on companies that will funnel information, funnel data directly back to China. We're concerned about Chinese intellectual property theft, hundreds of billions of dollars every year. We're worried about Confucius Institutes in the United States, which are propaganda arms of the party. So when we talk about cooperation on the pandemic, and I agree with my colleagues about the importance of such cooperation, we have to look at the big picture, the CCP's conduct over many decades to understand the very considerable obstacles to the cooperation between our countries, again, based on norms of fairness and reciprocity. In an earlier round, you asked about, or you underscored, Maria, the challenge of both competing and cooperating. That's nothing new. That is the challenge. And I think that the Trump administration, particularly Secretary Pompeo, deserves a lot of credit for not only educating the United States, but traveling the world to explain to our friends and partners around the world the complexity and the full context of dealing with China led by the CCP.
Thank you so much, Peter Berkowitz. We go next to Richard Fontaine. Richard, your thoughts and reaction to what you've heard so far with regards to COVID-19?
I think there has been a missed opportunity between the United States and China. If you contrast what's going on now with the aftermath of the global financial crisis, for all the differences, the G20, where both the United States and China are members, was a key kind of steering mechanism for coordinating fiscal and monetary policy after the global financial crisis. There are things well short of getting Chinese and American scientists together to work in a lab and cook up a vaccine together that could have been done, especially with respect to the international solutions on this with Gavi, the Global Vaccine Alliance, with helping poorer countries develop the distribution networks in advance of a vaccine and some of the economic responses. And in fact, none of that was done, not bilaterally, not in the G20, not in any other format, and neither side really seemed very interested in it. The part of this, I think, when we look at this mixture of cooperation and competition in areas where you can cooperate, it makes a big difference whether there's domestic political resonance for these issues or not. Something like North Korea, the average Chinese, I'm betting, doesn't really think much about, what the diplomatic approach to North Korea is. The American voter doesn't vote on North Korea, but specialists can get together and to some degree try to coordinate U.S. and Chinese approaches to North Korea. Same thing on some non-proliferation issues. This is the quintessential domestically sensitive issue when you're talking about COVID. So the Chinese Communist Party was at huge pains to avoid being blamed either domestically or internationally for what happened. So they covered up initially what happened, and they suggested the virus maybe actually came from the United States and was brought to Wuhan rather than from Wuhan itself. Then they blocked the inquiry into its origins, which they continue to do to today, even while saying, well, we're just asking questions. We don't know where it could go, but let's not answer those questions. And then you got Trump, who was running for office and didn't want to be blamed for the terrible American response. So he said it was the Chinese fault, it was the WHO fault, it was the governor's fault, it was the doctor's fault, it was somebody else's fault, right? When you have these issues where there's real domestic resonance and sensitivity, it's going to be pretty damn hard for the United States and China to come together and cooperate. The problem with that is sometimes those are the most important issues. So cooperation is possible and attractive, really, in theory, but in practice, it's really difficult.
And so that leads me nicely to Stephen Orleans. You work president of the National Committee on US-China Relations. What possible cooperation could we see on COVID-19 under a Trump presidency? And were there missed opportunities under the Trump presidency?
Maria, my great hope is that this tragedy becomes a teaching moment, that we saw governments in China and in the United States focus on the competitive aspects of the relationship rather than the cooperative, which led to the deaths of thousands of Chinese and hundreds of thousands of Americans. Think back to the CDC presence in China at the end of the Obama administration. We had roughly CDC, National Science Foundation, in our embassy in Beijing had 41 people, including American CDC folks who were embedded in China's CDC. Because of this strategic competition, the Trump administration reduced that, I think, from 41 to roughly 14, thereby robbing America of its early warning system and robbing China of the ability to analyze this disease more quickly. Then, because of the competition, as people have made reference to, American experts were not welcomed into China early in the pandemic, which could have helped America prepare better. So those the two competitive countries, rather than cooperating on something we needed to cooperate on, failed to, which led to the deaths of so many people. So my hope is that this is a teaching moment. I also would say that what will not happen in the Biden administration, as many have made reference to, is it won't be called the China virus. We won't have the Secretary of State say, quote, enormous evidence that COVID-19 originated in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. We won't have statements like that, which appear not to ultimately be true, be made by the most senior American diplomat. So my hope is this becomes a teaching moment, that we learn from this and we learn, yes, there are places we have to compete, but in climate change, in pandemics, in terrorism, and in economic crisis, as we did after the 2008 crisis, we need to cooperate. We need to find a way, as President-elect Biden says, to compete where we need to compete and cooperate where we need to cooperate.
Stephen, thank you very much indeed. Let's get the perspective now from China, and briefly, if you may, Professor Shi Jinghong, did President Trump and Xi Jinping miss an opportunity to cooperate this year on COVID-19? And what do you make of the criticism towards China from the US and from so many other countries in the world?
I think that if you take some of the largely non-political approach, if you have some romantic and consideration of the relationship in the COVID-19 pandemic, you could see that there are a lot of missed chance. There are a lot of, bilateral cooperation in combating the pandemic, which missed by both Beijing and Washington. I don't think so, because if you look at the highly political and even ideologically charged environment and which carved in the bilateral relationship, you will realize that even from the beginning, there's so few chance to have practical and substantial cooperation in combating the COVID-19 pandemic. And I do not want to list all of the negative elements. I only want to point to a even dangerous and self-defeating argument, which is so prevalent, especially in the United States and in Western countries, that is to establish a too close connection between, on one hand, the performance of national government in combating the COVID-19 pandemic, and on the other side, and their qualities, or even you can say good and evil of their political system. And so many people, and connect the early Chinese performance, which is not so wonderful, and especially in Wuhan, deal with the pandemic, to connect it to the nature of China's communist system. And but what about the months later, when China, use whatever means to so effectively to control and to fight back the pandemic within China, and you can say this proof communist power system in China is wonderful. And if you look at the United States, and millions of people have this disease, and hundreds of thousands of people die. And why? And we will have no reason to support some hawkish theories, and this liberal democratic United States fully did the system and defeated itself by its performance. So I think that this is quite dangerous and self-defeating arguments. But this kind of arguments is already and embedded deeply and in the political culture in the United States, in some other Western countries, and in another form also deeply and embedded in at least a lot of people, a lot of officials in China, a lot of institutions in China. So I don't think that there is much real chance, even now, to have both countries to have very practical and major cooperation in combating the COVID-19 pandemic. For example, and China have so few and the victims now and lived in China, which is a victim of COVID-19 pandemic. So most of China's vaccine, if effective, will come out of China. And the United States, and they will use their vaccine at first stages at least, and almost all in the United States. So if U.S. Look at China to send the vaccine to some country a lot of countries there, and ideological and political jealousy will play the role, say that this is China's instruments for the world domination. And so I think that unfortunately,
okay,
there are so
Professor
little.
Xi, I'm going to have to interrupt you.
To make
Professor
the
Xi, I'm going to have to interrupt you because we have to move on. Okay, we have to move on, but thank you so much for your remarks. And I just want to...
why other speakers can say their words, why I cannot say my words.
Professor Xi.
Everyone have to move on.
Okay, finish. Please do finish your sentence. Okay, we will continue. I just want to remind everyone that we're watching the TRT World Forum 2020 and we are live digitally from Istanbul. This session is entitled America versus China, Trade Wars, Covid-19 and Future Economic Relations. I'm Maria Ramos, and now we continue and we will be speaking about trade wars and economic relations. And I'm going to go back to our first guest, Stephen M. Walt. And I would like, if everybody could keep to, as briefly as possible. And the question is to you, Stephen, is the decoupling of the Chinese and American economies something that could really happen?
Well, I think as has already been mentioned, there's going to be a partial decoupling. That's really already underway, partly in response to the pandemic, partly in response to the trade war that has been underway, partly in some of the pressure that the United States in particular has been putting on high-tech Chinese industries, most notably Huawei as well. So we're seeing some of that occurring. And I think some of that is also firms responding to the recognition that if the political relationship between the United States and China continues to deteriorate, their own business operations in China or elsewhere may be affected by this. And therefore, just out of self-interest, firms want to diversify in various ways. So we're seeing some degree of decoupling. But I agree with what was said earlier. You're not going to see a complete decoupling. You're not going to see the American and Chinese economies completely separate themselves, even if the political competition intensifies, because, again, it's too important for China to continue to be able to trade with the United States, and it's too important to the United States to maintain its economic ties. What I do think you will see at the same time is something of a partial segmenting of the world from the sort of fully globalized vision that we had maybe 20 years ago, where we really thought borders were going to matter much less. Trade and investment was going to flow pretty much seamlessly around the world. And I think over time, we're going to see the emergence of more sort of partial orders, a U.S.-centered order that is going to have both an economic and a security dimension to it, featuring our allies in Asia, our allies in Europe, and probably the emergence for China of a set of countries that adapt more to the Chinese model than they do, say, to ours. This may be especially apparent in the digital realm, where some countries agree to sort of accept the Chinese model of how to handle digital technology, how to deal with digital privacy issues, maybe are more reliant upon Chinese technology, and other countries that decide to go the other way. Again, not a complete decoupling, but the emergence of sort of a Chinese-centric part of the world and an American-centric part of the world as we go forward, with some other countries it not being entirely clear where they're ultimately going to line up. You know, Russia now leaning towards the Chinese sphere, possibly over time. If differences emerge between Beijing and Moscow, it might realign in another direction. But I don't think you're going to see a complete decoupling, and that means, unlike the U.S.-Soviet Cold War, one of the items on the American-Chinese agenda is going to be managing that economic relationship, even at the same time that they are competing over all of the issues that Richard Fontaine laid out a few moments ago.
Thank you so much, Stephen M. Walt. I'll jump to Cheng Li. Is the decoupling of the Chinese and American economies something that could really happen? And do US companies really want that?
Well, it's just not something remote or not something just a scenario. I think you're right. It is happening, and it's happening to a degree that beyond anyone's imagination. And because of Chinese, they perceive that the United States want to completely and systematically decouple with China in trade and investment and technology and financial system, including even education. So therefore, they prepare, how to expand China's domestic market. This is the new catchword called the twin circulation, which is one big circulation domestically, and internationally, the trade with outside world become a smaller part. So this is a major strategic shift. Although it's not complete, it's still in debate. But that reflects Chinese worry or fear. If the two countries on the verge of military confrontation, I mean, everything, the trade or other things could happen. Now, of course, I agree with Steve and Charlie. This is probably undermine American interest. And I also agree with Steve, this is not like the Cold War, Soviet Union. But this precisely because of this, we should be very, very careful. And we should also understand how China will react or overreact. Now, despite that, I disagree with the people in Washington favor decouple, but I agree with a certain statement, for example, by FBI Director Christopher Wray. He has described the global economic landscape change in China's favor represents, I quote, represents one of the largest transfer of wealth in human history, which was the transfer of wealth from the United States to China. Now, this will not be comfortable. This will not be easy. I think that this reflects that the American middle class is shrinking while China's middle class is expanding. But the point is, Chinese still has poor understanding of the outside world, how outside world in Europe, in the United States, look at China. And China certainly have some controversial economic behaviors with intellectual property rights and market access, and we also use the term forced technology transfer, and etc. You do see that the long list. Of course, at the same time, China had a legitimate reason to pursue economic middle-class dream, but at the same time, China should comply with WTO regulations and to be a real stakeholders, responsible stakeholders. Now, these are things that it's very difficult to see that both sides' views. I think both sides have valid concern, but they just do not communicate in a way that that other people have the kind of empathy, has a respect for each other's legitimate concerns. So that's, I think that decoupling certainly happened very, very rapidly over the past year. But still, at the moment, I think, fortunately, with the arrival of Biden administration, he said very, very clearly, this is not a solution. I think that they will emphasize, probably, Biden administration will emphasize market access, intellectual property rights, and China's so-called state capitalism, but less on the trade and mutual investment and etc. There's a tremendous opportunity for financial sector to access China's market. So let me stop here.
Thank you so much. Charles Kupchan, decoupling, yes or no?
No. I mean, I sort of see us heading into what I would call a reconfigured era of globalization, in which there will be no full-scale decoupling. We're too invested in them, they're too invested in us. Just in the last couple of days, American companies have stepped forward to oppose a piece of legislation in Congress that would put tariffs and bans on produce from or things made in Xinjiang. I mean, so that there's a lot of corporate pressure to keep this relationship open. But I would agree with Steve that we're probably in the high tech realm headed into a world in which there will be more regionalization, more zones that play by a certain set of rules and others that play by a different set of rules. I probably see more variation than Steve. I don't think there'll be a kind of US-centered world and a China-centered world. I mean, on digital governance, on data privacy, Europe and the United States are having some tough conversations. So we may see a kind of multiple zones of governance when it comes to high tech. The other thing that I think is important to put on the table here is that we are seeing what I would call a walking away from the neoliberal orthodoxy. I'm not a big fan of the Trump presidency. This has been, for me, a very painful and destructive 4 years. We still today have a president who hasn't come out and said, I lost and I'm getting ready to leave. But one thing that I think we should harvest, one important lesson from the Trump presidency, is there are a lot of Americans out there who are unhappy, who haven't earned a living wage. And Biden has said, we're going to have policies that favor the middle class. A lot of that is investment, innovation, worker retraining. But I do think you're going to see a tougher conversation on trade and a lot of pressure being put on China to do more to level the playing field, to play by the rules of the WTO, to open up its domestic market. As Chung Lee just said, on finance, on a lot of other issues, there are a lot of companies out there that hope to have a more liberalized China market.
Thank you so much. Peter Berkowitz, what kind of conversations will we be seeing at the US State Department with regards to trade wars, economic relations between the US and China?
Well, I can tell you what we have been talking about, especially in regard to decoupling. I agree with some of the comments I've just heard, namely that radical decoupling is not in the cards. China's is the second largest economy in the world. It's not only a matter of America's entwinement with China's economy. All of our major friends and partners have economies that are entwined with that of China. There will be, as Professor Waltz said, a partial decoupling. I prefer to say a reduced reliance on China, especially when it comes to critical supply chains, medical equipment, medicines, high-tech equipment. But really, it seems to me, what we need to focus on is not radical decoupling, but more effective competition with China, and also more effective cooperation. How can we bring that about? Well, as the paper I've already mentioned that has been produced by the policy planning staff, the elements of the China challenge, lays out a 10-point framework in the final section. We point out, among other things, if the United States is going to compete effectively and cooperate effectively with China, we have to secure freedom at home, respect for our constitutional traditions, a bustling economy. I must throw in here that about the economy today, actually before the pandemic struck us in mid-March, unemployment was at a all-time low, especially for African Americans and Hispanics. The economy has been booming under President Trump. But we're also, for the sake of cooperation, for the sake of more effective competition, we have to maintain the world's best military. This is very important. We have to support a free, open, rules-based international order. We have to, with our friends and partners, we have to more effectively invest in friends and partners around the world. It's not enough for us to preach that it would be destructive for countries to open their infrastructure to Huawei and ZTE. It's important for us to present to countries better investment deals. It's important for us to continue with the clean network to unite other countries. And it's very important that that we educate our citizens properly to understand the importance of freedom to America's national traditions and to understand our stake in the world in defending the principles of freedom.
Thank you so much. Richard Fontaine, where do you see trade wars going next, economic relations and the possibility of decoupling?
Full decoupling is possible, but it's very unlikely because the cost would be too high. I mean, certain things remain true, like comparative advantage and economies of scale and lower prices for imported goods, or you don't import them in the first place. So some of those things are still true. And unless there's a particularly good reason to pay higher prices or to reduce growth in your economy, then these economies are unlikely to decouple because they would pay a cost from doing so. So then you look to the areas where they are willing to pay a cost. So for example, the United States and other countries are clearly willing to pay a higher cost for 5G than to allow Huawei to build out their 5G network. Well, is that a telecommunications decoupling? Yeah, kind of. The Chinese at some point may be willing to pay a higher price to have a Chinese indigenous operating system rather than iOS and Android or something, given the American dominance there. I mean, you can see this on pharmaceuticals, you can see this on rare earths and other sort of things where there's a national security or some other kind of acute interest in not relying on products or capital flows from the country with whom you're competing so fiercely. But that said, is there any particularly good reason why the United States wouldn't want to sell soybeans to China or wouldn't want to buy basic appliances from China if the benefits economically to doing so are there? Not really. And so I think what you're going to see is decoupling in a circumscribed area where there are other non-economic interests that are fairly obviously at stake. For the United States, it's going to be mostly in the high-tech realm, given U.S. concerns about freedom of speech, privacy, espionage, surveillance, things like that. But other things as well, again, rare earths and pharmaceuticals, things that we don't want to be relying on China. And China may have its own. But that's not going to be a full-scale decoupling where we go back to the way it was in the U.S.-China economic relationship in the 1980s or something like that.
All right. Stephen A. Orlins, full-scale decoupling, partial decoupling, radical decoupling, and trade wars and economic relations.
You have a remarkable consensus on this panel that we're going to see limited decoupling. And there seems to be agreement that that's okay. The cost of it are not too high, and we can live with it. There's probably not enough discussion in the United States about the impact of these export controls that lead to decoupling, that this costs a lot of American jobs, and we can decide, okay, national security needs to prevail, but we need to discuss how this affects jobs, how this affects American competitiveness, how this affects R&D budgets of American companies, that if we lose the China market, profitability goes down, R&D budgets go down, and our competitiveness decreases. When we think about this decoupling, it has to be multilateral. That if the United States says we're not going to sell this, but the Dutch will sell it, or the Brits, or the French, or the Germans, or the Japanese, or the South Koreans, we've really done nothing but hurt ourselves. I may be the only person on this call old enough to remember or to have worked in the COCOM days when the NATO allies, Japan, Korea, and the United States worked together to decide what could be licensed and what couldn't be licensed. And that allowed for a multilateral approach to the then USSR. So we coordinated this approach. Hopefully, if we're going to restrict exports, we restrict them from us, our allies, and our friends, that we don't do it unilaterally and just punish American companies and American workers. The Chinese, of course, started down the road of decoupling with its restrictions on Facebook, Google, YouTube, Twitter. I can go on and on. That led to a social media decoupling that started us down this path. Finally, I've been working on China from my time in government 43 years ago when I was in the State Department. I've witnessed lots of cycles in China: tightening, loosening, reform, centralization. And what we're probably seeing now with recent speeches by the president of China with recent openings to foreign financial sector firms, major openings. These are not minor things for Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, BlackRock, Blackstone. I could go on. We're seeing, I think, the pendulum start to swing back. And I just would close with, I was reading one of President Xi's speeches this morning, and he said, turn China, this is my translation, hopefully it's right, turn China into a market for the world, a market shared by all, and a market accessible to all. And if that's where the Chinese are going now, we, our NATO allies, Japan, South Korea, and ASEAN need to be aware of it and need to be able to participate.
Stephen Orlins, thank you very much indeed for those remarks. Now, Professor Shi Jinghong, you've heard a lot of opinions there. Tell us, what do you see with regards to decoupling? Full-scale, partial, radical? Give us your opinion, the perspective from China.
I think although there are only a few months past, but two things have already become so clear. One thing is that, and not only the United States perhaps is unable to decouple from China in largely sense, concrete sense. And the more important is that the United States do not require to decouple its economy from China. But on the other hand, and one thing is so dramatically emerging in the stage, that is an expanded selective decoupling. And in the so-called strategic attack, and the Trump administration have ruthlessly and in a dramatic pace to decouple from China. And this is a situation largely I don't doubt that largely will continue in the coming months and even years. And of course, and I believe that it's probable, it's likely that President Biden will relaunch the so-called another round of trade negotiation with China and focus on so-called structural change. But I guess my government this time will become tougher than it has during the so-called phase of trade negotiation with Trump administration. Because in Chinese eyes, I guess there are a lot of requirement for structural change, and in United States in terms to let China's, especially high-tech enterprises, have access to American technology and American market. And I don't think that if there would be a new round of the so-called second phase of trade negotiation, and the path will be easier than during the Trump administration. This time, I guess, China will become tougher.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Shi Jinghong. Right, we come to the last segment of our debate. We've got about 12 minutes left. A question, I'm going to put it to Charles Kupchan because it's a quote from your book, Isolationism, in that you write, the ongoing rise of China will soon bring about the end of US primacy. Why? That question to you, Charles, about your book.
Well, I think that if you just look at the numbers, the Chinese economy in aggregate GDP will surpass the American economy sometime in this decade. And we know from history that when a great power rises economically, it also rises geopolitically. And we're already seeing China push out. And as a consequence, I think we're headed into a period in history in which there will be a much more wide distribution of power, both economic and military, than we have seen for quite a while. And to me, the big issue of the day is when we get to that world that is no longer dominated by the United States and its democratic partners, will we be able to sustain a rules-based system? Will we be able to find a meeting of the minds with countries that are not democratic on the big questions of the day? The trade questions, the governance questions, intervention, war, peace. These are the big questions that lie before us. And I also think that this change will be expedited by the fact that the United States is entering a period in which the domestic agenda will be very demanding and very absorbing. My guess is that Biden will continue the retrenchment from the Middle East. There is a strong desire across the political spectrum for an end to the forever wars. I don't see the U.S. pulling back in any way from the Asia Pacific, in part because China is there and pushing out. But I do think that we're entering a period in which not only is the distribution of power in the world changing, but we're likely to see changes in American foreign policy toward a more judicious and discriminating brand of engagement, because that's what the American people want.
Thank you, Charles. Back to you, Stephen. What next for US global influence and a rising China? And if I can ask you, all of you gentlemen, to be as brief as you can. We've got about 10 minutes left. I want to get through all of you before we close on this point.
We can't hear you.
My question, Stephen, what next for US global influence and a rising China, as briefly as possible? Can you hear us? Stephen? All right. I'll go next to Peter while we work on your sound, Stephen. Peter, if you can hear me, what next for US global influence and a rising China, as briefly as possible? All right. We seem to have some technical issues there. What I will do right now is remind you that we are watching the TRT World Forum 2020, and we are in the middle, coming to the end, actually, 10 minutes left to go of our debate right now. So we're going to now speak to Mr. Xi and put that question to him, what he thinks about a rising China and US global influence. If you can hear me, Professor Xi, your opinion on that?
Yes. I think that there is, on one hand, definite power transition is in play. And relatively speaking, in the United States, relatively speaking, compared with the past and compared with China, and the US power is in decline. And China power is rising. But this is just in process. And this is not a end of the drama. And maybe the United States will rise again and China will face a lot of generally unsolvable domestic international hurdles. And who knows? So I want to emphasize this drama is just in process. And temporary situation is not necessarily a lasting situation. But one thing is certain, if the United States not to emancipate from its present highly divided situation, not emancipated from its relative isolation, and in a lot of regions, a lot of corners in the world, I think the next stage situation will continue an advantage to China. Although this don't mean that in the end, necessarily China will replace the United States as world leader. Because world leader, I agree with Mr. Trump, world leader is not so worthy matter, and everyone should first to focus on its own home. Maybe and go out a lot, go out actively is self-defeating.
Thank you so much, Xi Jinping. Fantastic. We go back to Stephen Walt. We heard from, well, I quoted the book, from Charles Kupchan's book, where he said the ongoing rise of China will soon bring about the end of US primacy. I wanted to see what you thought about US global influence and a rising China.
Yeah, well, the condition the United States was in the 1990s as the unipolar power with no real peer competitors is very unusual. It really had never happened in centuries, and that was not going to last forever. And that we are now back in a world which is either emerging bipolarity or a very lopsided form of multipolarity, where the United States and China will be the two most powerful countries in the world. I still think the United States has many advantages over China, but the gap is clearly narrowing. I think in that world, the United States can't operate in quite the unchecked manner that it once did. It will have to compete with China, but in a realistic way. It's not going to be able to transform China into a liberal democracy, and it shouldn't try. We would resent it if China tried to turn us into a one-party state. We will have to do this in partnership with allies and work very effectively with them in order to succeed. And we'll have to be careful not to get distracted by things like the war in Iraq, which was a huge gift to China. That's how we're going to have to wage this competition in a world where the United States, for the first time in, say, 25 years or so, faces a genuine great power rival.
Thank you so much. Peter Berkowitz, what next for US global influence and a rising China? As briefly as possible, please.
Briefly as possible. It seems to me that the future of freedom in our world is bound up with freedom, prosperity, and at least civic concord in the United States. And the United States working with our partners, friends, allies, partners around the world who are devoted to preserving free, open, rules-based international order. So we have to see the big picture. We have to understand what's at stake. What's at stake is China continues to be ruled by by the CCP, one-party repressive rule. The party continues to engage in economic coercion and co-optation around the world, defies international law in its own region, attempts to rewire international organizations to serve authoritarian ends. We have to understand just how much is at stake in the United States, and so we must work, as others have said, we must work with allies, friends, and partners in defense of freedom.
Thank you so much, and for being brief. Cheng Li, if I could ask you to do this in a minute, because we've only got a very few minutes to go. What next for US influence and a rising China?
Well, the rise and decline of a major power is not linear, and it's not necessarily inevitable. I think the mistake or the lessons learned from our leaders could make a huge difference. The fact is that I think that both countries will remain very, very powerful. Using Dr. Kissinger's words, this is almost equally powerful, China and United States. They're different, but they're equally powerful. So it will not unlikely that one country will defeat the other. So don't pursue a total war or total victory. I think these two countries need to find a way to work together. I think that nothing is more important than prevent a devastating war with no winner. I think this is the most important issue facing humanity and facing these two great powers.
Thank you. Richard Fontaine, US global influence and a rising China. What next for them?
Long-term competition. So you're not going to see a super coherent China bloc and American bloc the way you saw around the US and the USSR during the Cold War. Most countries around the world want some mixture of security and economic benefits from both the United States and China. So things are not going to break down along terribly clear lines. There's some areas where both countries will have an interest in cooperation, though I think for the reasons we said, that's going to be difficult. There are a lot of areas where our values diverge and our interests diverge. So what you're left with almost by process of elimination, because a war would be disastrous. A Cold War on the Cold War model isn't sort of as clean and likely as possible, is a long-term competition where both sides look across all the different domains, allies, technology, economics, military, diplomatic, for advantage over the other. And that's what you're going to see for the time being.
Thank you, Richard. Stephen Orlins, the final word from you and for this debate on US global influence and a rising China. And if you could do it in a minute, we would be very grateful.
Okay, well, clearly both countries need to work, both governments and businesses and the people need to work very hard to avoid the Thucydides trap, because that would be, as Cheng-Li has said, that would be a catastrophe for the world. Let me just close with one story, which a friend who is the national security advisor of China told me during the Obama administration. President Obama gets up and he's briefed on Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, Venezuela. President Xi gets up and he's briefed on Tibet, Xinjiang, Sichuan, Chengdu, a whole host of domestic issues. China sees its threats as domestic, not international. And to the extent that they are not confronted in this way, which calls into question whether the Chinese Communist Party can continue to rule, they have a different response.
Thank you so much for being brief and for your great remarks, Stephen Orlins. Thank you to all of our panel. And that brings to an end our debate. Thank you once again to all of my panelists for your time and sharing your expertise with us here at the TRT World Forum. Stephen M. Walt, Charles Kupchan, Shi Ying Hong, Peter Berkowitz, Cheng-Li, Richard Fontaine, and Stephen A. Orlins. Thank you, all of you, gentlemen. And to our audience, thank you. And that brings to a close the first day of the TRT World Forum 2020. Day 2 resumes tomorrow at 8:30 GMT. I'm Maria Ramos. See you soon on TRT World. Bye-bye for now.